I want to welcome you back to the Christian Atheist. This is Pastor Stephen and Pastor Dave here, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about a topic today that we all know about, and it's a hot topic in our culture, and that's the topic of sex. And there's not a specific chapter in the Christian Atheist about the topic of sex, but there is a chapter that's very relevant to this topic that we're going to be looking at today, and that's chapter 9. It's called When You Believe in God but Pursue Happiness at Any Cost. And I think that we're going to find that some of the insights that Craig Groeschel gives us in this chapter are really relevant for how we should think about sex as Christians. And Pastor Dave, I just want to start out by reading you a quick section out of this chapter and get some of your thoughts on what you think about this. On page 165, Craig says this. He says, "While it's true that God wants to bless you and has great plans for you, we venture into extremely dangerous territory when we start to believe that God's ultimate plan for us is our happiness. As Christian atheists, we can subtly believe in God and confidently pursue happiness at all costs. This seemingly slight misunderstanding radically reverses our role with God's role. If we believe that God wants us happy above all else, rather than acknowledging that our role is to serve God, we wrongly believe that God exists to serve us. God becomes a means to our end, happiness." And I think as I read this quote, I'm thinking about the fact that many people do believe that God really wants us to be happy. And so people might even say, I know that God wants me to be happy, Pastor Dave. And so why shouldn't I be able to pursue whatever I want in my sex life that makes me happy? Why shouldn't I be able to do whatever I want as long as that makes me happy? I wonder what your thoughts are on that and how our quest for happiness and how that relates to sex.
Thank you, Stephen. Be happy to speak to that. I just want to make a note that last week I promised you I was going to ask you easy questions. And here the first question you asked me is on sex. Thanks, Stephen. Hey, that's a great question, though, because we do feel like we are created by our wonderful Maker for the pursuit of happiness, and anything that stands in that way doesn't seem right. But we need to remember that our Creator created us with a design. Stephen, the first command in all the Bible is not don't have sex or don't do this or don't do that. But the first command in the Bible is be fruitful and multiply. That means that sex is really God's idea. It's His gift to us. He is thrilled when we as His children receive this part of our humanity. And yet, God also knows that this wonderful gift can be very much misused. So He gives it to us in a certain context. Now, what if God had said, be fruitful and multiply whenever you want, whatever you want, in whatever situation you want? If God would have said that, then our world today would not be a very nice place. Today we have over 20 sexually transmitted diseases causing great harm and heartache in our culture. Just imagine if everyone's starting point was have sex with as many people as you can, whenever you can, without regard to anything other than your own particular sense of pleasure and happiness. I think we'll quickly realize that all of these sexually transmitted diseases would be in epidemic proportion, causing great misery and harm to our lives. So what we think of as giving us happiness, really in the end, doesn't work that way at all. In fact, that's the tempter's lie from the very beginning, that if you go against God's good and loving word for your life, it will go well with you. God lovingly gives us that command to put it in the right context so we can experience the fullness of happiness, not just the pleasure, but all the joy and the deep kind of contentment that God created us to experience when we in fact are fruitful and multiply. I'm reminded of a story that Pastor Anley Stanley tells. He was giving a presentation on God's gift of sexuality to some young people. There was a woman in her 30s who had been married and was now single, and she heard that presentation. She was really drawn to a number of things that he said. She wanted to discuss with him, however, a few of the finer points, so she tried to get a hold of him. A couple of days later, she was finally able to get him on the phone. He only had a very short period of time to talk to her, And she said, now, I love what you said to the kids, but that really applies only to teenagers. It doesn't really apply to grown-up adults who now are able to make their own mature choices, does it? Stanley thought to himself and realized he only had a few minutes. He couldn't give her the 20-minute version. So he really prayed to God that somehow he would be able to have the grace to know how to respond to this lady. And in that moment, God gave him a thought, and he asked her this question. He said, has sex outside of marriage made your life better or just more complicated? Her response was, I'm afraid to say, it's made it more complicated. Things get real complicated in ways that we can't uncomplicate when we do it our way rather than God's way.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dave. I think that we can all take those words, and that we really need to hear that. I want to point out another topic that he points out here in the book, and here he talks about a story about a woman in his church that came and spoke with him. And I'd like to just share this story because I think this is a real eye-opening thing. He says, recently I had a conversation after church with a young woman who retraced a string of decisions that seemed right at the time. That's the key. They seemed right at the time. When Rachel met Mitch in a co-ed softball league, she thought he was exceptionally witty and cute, and it seemed right to her to date him, even though he wasn't a Christian. When he continued to avoid the subject of marriage, she thought moving into his apartment with him would make him happy, so it seemed right. Although she knew she shouldn't have sex with him, since it made him happy and made her feel loved, she did what seemed right. When Rachel discovered that she was pregnant, it seemed right that they should marry. Last week, Mitch said he never loved her, and he walked out, leaving Rachel broke, devastated, and alone with a new baby. Even though every decision seemed like it would lead to happiness, all of them led to one desperate and seemingly hopeless situation. Pastor Dave, where did this woman go wrong in her thinking?
As I think about this particular situation, I think about the fact that all of us have two very basic needs in life. The first is the need to be accepted. We want people to like us, and this is really true, Stephen, when it comes to the guy-girl relationship, the man-woman relationship, because when we begin a relationship, a courtship, we really want to put our best foot forward. If you're a guy, you borrow your college roommate's hot new car, and you go to pick up your date in this car, thinking maybe she won't ask and she'll think it's really yours. And maybe the young lady spends about 2.5 hours in front of the mirror and about 3 hours sitting in a bubble bath, getting so that she'll be just as beautiful as she can possibly be that first night. But we know that's unsustainable. And so as we go into a relationship, things begin to grow, and also things begin to change. And we begin to experience the other great need in a relationship, and that is the need to be known. We want people, Stephen, to know us as we really are, not just the image that we have. And so there come those honest moments when the guy will say, well, you know, this car is not really all mine. I kind of share it with my roommate. Well, it's actually theirs. I'm using his car. And the girl might say, well, you know, here's some things about me that I didn't want you to see, but they're really part of who I am. And we begin to share who we are. God has created a place where we can have both our need to be loved, our need to be accepted, and our need to be known put together. And that is in the context of unconditional commitment to one another, or said another way, the context of marriage. Now, in this particular situation, she thought in every instance that she was having her need to be loved. She was having her need to be met, and he was having his need to be met. But because there wasn't a commitment to it, the relationship did not have a chance to grow, because you see, we can only really deepen in our love when we know it's in the context of unconditional acceptance, when we know we can really be free to be who we are, because we know that there have been times in life when we share who we are and that vulnerability has been violated and we've been embarrassed or hurt very deeply. God's given us that place called marriage where we can share all that we are and the other person can accept us and love us. And the irony is that when we say that I will only give of myself sexually to you in the context of commitment, that raises the bar for guys. And they have to decide, do I really want to pursue this relationship? Well, if they don't, you've saved your heartache early. But oftentimes it will make a person change their mind about the girl, and they'll say, this is the kind of woman I'm really drawn to. She has a standard. She's challenging me to have a higher standard. And because he makes that commitment, maybe you avoid the kind of situation where at the end of the road, the man finally realizes this wasn't the relationship for him. Better sooner rather than later, or better even still, that he has a growth process where he comes to see that as he follows her lead and begins to share of his weaknesses and they begin to grow in their commitment, they can together experience this kind of love that God has only in the context of marriage. Not I love you because you're so beautiful, or not I love you if you continue to be all the things I hope you'll be, but I love you with a sacred promise that we make to one another to be faithful so that our love can flourish and grow and always deepen.
Yeah, I think that that's really good. And, I've found that there's a particular analogy for marriage that I've always appreciated. And I just leave you all with this particular thought as you get ready to discuss in your small group. One of the analogies that I've found really helpful when it comes to marriage is the analogy of a fire in a fireplace. And we know that a fire can be enjoyed when it's in a fireplace. When you have a fire in a fireplace, it can be enjoyed. You can have warmth from it. It's where it's meant to be, and that's where we can really use it for the purpose that it was intended. Now, if you take the fire out of the fireplace and you have that in your living room, then the fire can become very destructive. In fact, it can burn your whole house down. And so when you take the fire out of that context of the fireplace, it becomes not something you can enjoy, but something that can be very destructive. And I think we can use that analogy for how we should think about sex as Christians, because what God has given us is marriage, which is a context that we can enjoy sex. As Pastor Dave said, it's a gift from God, but it's meant to be enjoyed in a specific context, which is a marriage between a man and a woman. And when we remove it from that context, then sex can become very destructive, and we use it in ways that were not intended by God. So I hope that for your group, whether you're somebody who is married or somebody who is single, maybe you're somebody who's dating right now, I hope that some of these thoughts can be helpful to you as you think about sex. And I hope that you have a good discussion in your group about this topic this week.